Professor, many thanks for your time this morning. Let's talk about that, maybe a general high-level sense of how Biden did in his first year in office.
He had a very hard hand to play, and I think anyone who tries to forecast American politics right now is running a high degree of risk because the country is very polarized. It's been working through some very, very difficult issues. As we know, the Omicron variant is the latest, but inflation is running high, and that's causing Biden a lot of discomfort. And there is generally the looming Republican effort to suppress voters and to make the congressional elections next year much closer and maybe favorable to the Republicans in ways that are not democratic but are potent within the U.S. system.
Right, let's focus on how he's dealt with the pandemic. It's something that the entire world has looked on, countries like the US in terms of direction. Some would argue that he's done rather well in terms of providing African countries with vaccines so that everybody can get inoculated, and kind of put aside the story around Western countries hoarding vaccines. Your thoughts on the direction that he and his team have taken when it comes to dealing with COVID-19, not just for the US, but for the world at large?
That's a very awkward question for me, sitting in South Africa with great sympathies toward the South African complaint that the travel ban really hurt the tourist industry, and unnecessarily so, of avoiding the science and playing politics, which I think Biden felt, given his precarious situation politically in the U.S., he had to show decisiveness. But I listened to the comments that he made yesterday about the Omicron strategy that he's pursuing, and it was all very focused naturally on the internal U.S. situation. But I don't think that he's been a responsible stakeholder internationally, despite the generous provision of some vaccinations. It's been vaccine nationalism overwhelmingly, and it's a sign of which is of concern to all of us who are Democrats. Can democracies that are trying to be responsive primarily to their own people still be responsible international stakeholders on something like a pandemic, which is global in its threat and has to be dealt with globally? And I'm afraid that Biden on this score does not impress me very positively.
What would impress you when coming to dealing with the pandemic? Because this is something that is going to remain with the world for some time. In terms of the way in which he should be handling it, the engagements he should be having, what would you say is the best way to approach this, Prof?
That's a very good question. And I hate to recall his time as vice president, but in fairness, Barack Obama's response to the Ebola crisis in West Africa was prompt and fulsome, and he deployed with acceptance by the states involved, U.S. troops and the CDC. They all were coordinated. Now, it's an unfair criticism, perhaps, of Biden to after all, recognize that Donald Trump was president when the virus erupted, and the 800,000 deaths of Americans, the majority have to be laid at Trump's bungling of the initial handling of the COVID crisis. He did put in place the drug research that led to the vaccines that we have now, and that's been quite a miraculous performance technologically. But politically, I think it was a disaster the way Trump handled it, and then Biden inherited that. And Biden hasn't done much better, frankly, on the global stage. I would have liked to have seen much more decisive action, but that may be an unfair criticism because he was not in power when the really the decisive action needed to be taken and the preparations needed to be taken.
Right, let's move on to another issue now, Prof. Something that Biden had to deal with was the disaster that happened in Afghanistan. Your thoughts on the way in which the United States has dealt with that during the period when it was unfolding and subsequently?
Well, the removal of U.S. troops and U.S. presence in Afghanistan was done in a very messy and regrettable way. I don't know, frankly, what the alternatives were, but he certainly inherited a problem that never should have been turned into a nation-building project. That, I think, historians will be quickly agreed upon. And the United States has made some very bad mistakes, despite warnings from South Africa, by the way, on the Iraq handling of that invasion and that there were not any weapons of mass destruction. But there's a record of nation-building projects which have not gone well. The only really good ones were Germany and Japan after World War II. And in my lifetime, it's been Vietnam, and it's been Iraq, and it's been now Afghanistan. And the tragedy of Afghanistan is that the Taliban is really being very terrible to women and being very terrible in its managing of the economy. But the U.S. is not at all being helpful, of course. And as a result, the money that they have of Afghans is being held in U.S. banks and not being released.
Two final thoughts from you, Prof, before we end off our discussion. The first one that I want to unpack with you very briefly, the economy of the United States. We have seen strong consumer demand, a steady stabilization in the labor market, but the biggest fear has been inflation in the United States. But overall, what would you make of the way that the direction that the economy has taken under his leadership over the past year?
Well, there are two things here. There's the politics and there's the economics. The economics are not all that bad, although inflation, if it continues, and it may not, because we are in a transition, but inflation is a lethal political issue for any president in power. I think back to Jimmy Carter in running against Reagan. And inflation, as much as the Iranian hostage crisis, probably did him in. And his response to inflation, which was very decisive. But nevertheless, he didn't get rewarded for that. And I think Biden is in the same predicament of how do you manage this inflationary problem while at the same time continuing to do Build Back Better and other projects which are really, really important and overdue. And he's had a very frustrating year indeed politically. And I think he should have some sympathy for Cyril Ramaphosa's problems down here because they're in some ways similar.
No, absolutely. And then with that, Professor, your thoughts in terms of what will unfold in the midterms. No doubt some work will need to be put in by the Democrats for them to maintain their House majority.
Well, they only have a 5-seat majority in the House, and they have a 50-50 split in the Senate. And this is a function of the archaic Constitution that the United States still operates under. But nevertheless, it presents Biden with a huge, huge problem. And I think that the Republicans could win in 2020 and take over the Congress, which personally I think would be a disaster for all of the programs that I'd like to see the U.S. pursue that would be good for U.S.-South African relations.
No, absolutely. Professor John Stremlau, thank you very much for your time this morning, talking us through Biden's first year, how he's fared, some good things, some not so great things, but of course he's got an entire term to make sure that he provides the best for Americans, but also just better engagements with the world at large.